This episode is brought to you by Pine Melon. Pine Melon is the farmer's market delivered right to your doorstep. But this isn't just any grocery delivery service. Pine Melon connects with local farmers, ranchers, and producers, meaning you're supporting local agriculture with every order. Save time and skip a grocery trip by ordering online now at pinemelon.com. Plus, if you use code CityCastDenver, you get $75 off your first delivery. Again, use code CityCastDenver to save $75 on your first grocery order at pinemelon.com.
Today on CityCast Denver, have you ever had a paycheck that showed up a little bit light or worked overtime but never paid extra? You might be one of the tens of thousands of Denver area workers who fall victim to wage theft every year. But maybe not for long. Matthew Fritzmauer manages the city office that's been cracking down on wage theft, and he's on today to share some advice to workers who might be at risk and talk about the new tools he's using to get your stolen wages back. Today is Monday, September 23rd. I'm Paul Caroli, and here's what Denver's talking about. Matthew Fritzmauer, welcome to CityCast Denver.
Thanks. Really happy to be here.
So I feel like I didn't really hear about wage theft in Denver at all until a few years ago, and now I hear about it all the time. Is the city doing something new, or is the problem getting worse?
So I think a couple of things have happened that led to you hearing about it a lot more. The first is that about 15 or 20 years ago, someone coined the term wage theft.
Oh, really? It's that new?
It's that new. And you can see why they did, right? Wage theft tells you that someone's rights are being violated. It evokes a visceral reaction in the listener. And so in the last, 15 years, there has been a lot more research on the problem. Our understanding of the size and the scope of wage theft across the country, and then also in particular places, has grown dramatically. Colorado started taking some additional steps to recognize and address the problem of wage theft. And Denver, in many ways, has gone above and beyond what the state has done.
And now that's your position now, is to lead the city's efforts to combat wage theft. That's right.
I am one of the people who leads the city's efforts
How
to
big is
combat
the
wage
team?
theft. I think we have around 33 people now in our Denver labor division.
Let's talk about the scope of the problem, because I read earlier this year that you all had collected $2 million in restitution for workers last year, which was like a huge increase on the previous year. But you said the scope of the problem in Denver is growing. What do you think the scope of the problem in Denver is?
So I think it's important to talk about what wage theft is in general. And let's start with the definition, which is broad and pretty simple and straightforward. Wage theft happens anytime someone isn't paid the wages that they're entitled to under any applicable law, agreement, legal rule, regulation, or contract, like an oral promise. But it's also important to understand what wage theft means to the people who experience it and to all of us. Wage theft can be personally devastating for the people who suffer it. Disproportionately, we're talking about people who don't have a lot of social and economic power. Disproportionately, we're talking about people with limited formal education, non-citizens, immigrants, women, and people of color who are more likely to have their wages stolen. And it can be really hard to make ends meet, especially in an expensive city like Denver, and even harder if you're living paycheck to paycheck and you miss out on even $50 or $100. And what we see is that wage theft causes all of these cascading economic harms that people suffer. It makes people hungrier, less able to pay their bills, less able to pay rent, more at risk for eviction. And those things are really things that destabilize families and destabilize communities, and they hurt all of us.
Undoubtedly, though, but I'm asking about the scope of the problem in the city. $2 million in restitution last year is a lot, but is that compared to $1 billion worth of wage theft happening in the city? I just don't know how prevalent it is.
So I actually brought a preview of some data that we're going to release next week.
Great.
Earlier this year, Auditor O'Brien commissioned some research from the Workplace Justice Lab at Rutgers University and asked them to look into minimum wage theft in Denver and the surrounding areas, so we could understand what industries are high risk, what kinds of people are high risk, and what is the scope of the problem. The study covered 2007 to 2022, used data collected by the Bureau of Labor Statistics and the U.S. Census Bureau, and here are the estimates. On average, at least 45,000 workers per year in the Denver area are paid less than minimum wage. In Denver alone, they estimate today, every year, and this is a conservative estimate, it's at least 30,000 people being paid less than minimum wage.
Wow.
Yeah, it costs the average affected worker around $3,000 a year. On average, over the 15 years of this study, it costs them $136 million. And that number has gone up recently. They estimate at least $250 million in the Denver metro area, just in minimum wage violations.
That's just the people who work minimum wage.
Yeah, so we're not talking about all of the other forms of wage theft like overtime violations or paid sick leave violations or just being paid less than you were promised. So we're very proud of that $2 million number, but we are also aware that it's just a fraction of what's happening.
Yeah, I mean, 2 million versus 136 million. That's a mountain to climb for sure. Industries, by industry, we're talking about minimum wage workers, and then you mentioned like overtime or bonuses, being deprived counts as wage theft too. Are there specific industries where you find this is more prevalent or that you're maybe targeting for your efforts to regulate this?
Yeah, so we're allowed to use data to proactively open investigations, and we do that, and it's part of the reason the auditor wanted this research. And so what the researchers found was that minimum wage violations are highest in the following industries: private households, something like home health care.
Or like maybe like a house cleaner or like a landscaper or something.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Okay. That makes a lot of sense. That's a lot of like, handshake deals, I would imagine.
Food services and drinking places, personal and laundry services, and then accommodations.
What's accommodations?
Hotels, hostels, lodging. Yeah, work that happens in there. Those are the high risk industries, some of them.
Interesting. So Matthew, you mentioned this number that you expect, this estimate of how much wage theft is happening for minimum wage workers in Denver, $136 million. That's a lot more than the $2 million that you collected last year. I wonder if you have any theories for why that huge discrepancy exists.
Yeah, I think that there are two main reasons. The first is there are always going to be some limited resources. So we can't be everywhere at once. We can't find every case.
Right. You got 33 people in your office. If you had 150, maybe you could get a lot more.
Yeah, and we're good at what we do, but there are just some practical limitations. Part of the reason we can't find every case is because when it comes to wage theft, even though a lot of people often know what's happening to them, they know they're not being paid minimum wage, they know they're not getting overtime, they know that that's a violation of their rights. People, especially lower income people, especially people of color, are really unlikely to try to take formal action over their wage theft, including by filing a complaint with the government.
So people just don't complain.
Yeah, and there are some understandable reasons for that. The biggest reason people give is that they're afraid of retaliation. They're concerned that they're going to lose their job or be taken off the schedule or just get bullied at work. And again, it can be really hard to survive paycheck to paycheck, and even being out of work for a week can be hard.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, I've heard plenty of stories like that. I've experienced that myself. It's got to be hugely courageous to come forward to file a complaint with your office, to invite the government to come step in a dispute with your employer. Like, how often would you say that these situations get resolved peacefully and amicably, and then everyone goes back to work together on Monday,
People are more likely to try to resolve wage theft informally. But typically, people are going to come forward to the government or they'll file a lawsuit when they reach a breaking point, when they lose their job or they find a new job and decide that enough is enough. I've had too much money taken from me. I'm too offended by this. I have to do something. It's really hard for people to get to that point, especially once you consider that a lot of people, they don't necessarily have a lot of faith in their own power to do something. They don't have a lot of faith in the willingness or the power of the government to care about their issues and to take care of them. So those are things that we try to address proactively all the time by working with community groups, by being out in community spaces, by telling people that we care and that they're not alone.
But it sounds like the cases that you work on are cases where it's like someone has left a bad job and they're trying to make good. They're trying to get back what's owed to them and they're trying to move on with their lives.
A lot of the complaint-based cases are, but we also try to lower barriers to coming through our doors. So we take anonymous complaints, we take third-party complaints, and we also do proactive investigations on our own initiative, where we open up an investigation and examine whether there's wage theft, even in the absence of a complaint of any kind.
This episode is brought to you by Be Civic. Be Civic is an affiliate of the Denver Metro Chamber Leadership Foundation. Together, they are a force of business and community leaders who are passionate about building strong communities and running smart, successful organizations. Be Civic gives organizations of all industries, structures, and sizes the connections, resources, and inspiration they need to be civic-minded while meeting business goals. This year, the nonprofit celebrates its 10th anniversary at the Be Civic Summit, A Decade of Purpose. The conference brings together hundreds of purpose-driven professionals to advance social impact in our communities. Check out the Decade of Purpose Summit on November 13th and 14th in downtown Denver. To learn more about Be Civic and the conference, visit becivic.org. That's just the letter B, civic.org. This episode is brought to you by the Logan School. Hey, Olivia, when I was a kid, I was curious about neotropical parrots and how radios worked. Did you ever feel that way?
Definitely. I was curious about so many different things, like how language was created, why hermit crabs molt, even collecting retail tags to learn about patterns and design.
Totally. At the Logan School, curiosity isn't just a question, it's the answer. Here, kids explore their own passions and choose what and how they learn.
So, like no textbooks or boredom?
Exactly. At Logan, learning is an adventure and kids come home buzzing with stories. They dive deep into subjects that excite them.
Sounds awesome.
It is. At Logan, they nurture creative minds and let them lead the way. If you're looking for a school that inspires, they have tours Wednesdays at 9:30 a.m., October through December. You can visit theloganschool.org to RSVP and learn more. That's theloganschool.org.
Well, you talked about being able to use data to launch an investigation. That kind of gets me to this other new thing in your world. The city council earlier this year voted unanimously to give your office subpoena power. And we learned last week that you have just issued your first subpoenas. So I want to talk about this case to the extent that you can, because it's so interesting. It's an industry we've talked about a lot on the show. It's very, very interesting. Strip clubs. You've issued these subpoenas to PT's Show Club, Diamond Cabaret, and PT's Centerfold because it sounds like you suspect that there's wage theft happening there. What's happening?
We are examining whether there's wage theft, and we are in particular examining whether the dancers or the entertainers at these clubs are misclassified as something other than an employee or a worker. Now, it's important to keep in mind that a lot of the laws we like the most in this country, the laws that create basic fairness and dignity at work, like the minimum wage, like the right to overtime or paid sick leave, those only apply to people who are classified a certain way, usually as employees. So if someone is misclassified, then it's likely that there are also minimum wage and other violations. And so we're looking at whether these dancers are actually in a relationship with these clubs such that they should be paid at least minimum wage and overtime and be provided paid sick leave.
So that's interesting. I mean, I know that this kind of, I've heard about this issue in this industry of people not being employees versus contractors, but that also seems to be like the club's defense. There was some reporting after you issued your subpoenas, and the clubs responded with a statement saying, it's essential to emphasize that Denver Labor, that's you, has not identified any actual wage theft, yet they continue to unlawfully demand excessive documentation, which creates an undue burden on the clubs. How would you respond to that?
So we haven't reached any final conclusions in these cases, but what we're trying to do is get to a point where we can reach a final conclusion. So what we subpoenaed is exactly what City Council envisioned we would subpoena when they gave us this new authority. Information we need in order to determine whether wage theft is going on and to what extent. And specifically in this case, we asked for the contracts that the clubs have with their dancers and records of payments made to or taken from the dancers. Now, obviously, those records and those contracts are going to be extremely important to understand the working conditions of these people and whether they are misclassified and whether they're having their money stolen.
I guess I can see from their perspective that like if you don't have any evidence and you're launching this investigation, this is going to cause a burden on them. This is going to cost them money. So why target them specifically?
I wouldn't say that we have no evidence. I would say that it's an open investigation and I can't talk about what evidence we have or don't have. The clubs know much of the evidence that we have. The reason we open these investigations is because strip clubs are an industry where there is a high risk of workers' rights violations. We know that. We know that from dozens of court cases across the country, from research. And we also know that from talking to some people, both in and out of Denver. I personally was at a community event last year, and a woman came up to me and she said, "I'm a stripper, and my manager takes my tips. Is that allowed?" And I said, "That's a red flag." I gave her my card. I asked her to call me. She never did. But that plus the data we have that we understand that shows that this is an industry at risk caused us to open these investigations.
Interesting. So there's another part of this that I wanted to ask you about, because I've heard from some dancers about advantages to being classified as independent contractors. Like it allows them to work at different clubs at different nights and maybe go after nights where they can expect bigger tips. You know, you hear the same kind of thing from like servers at restaurants. Like they like living on tips because of the thrill of like the Friday night haul. And then, you know, maybe you can take a week off. You know, that sort of unreliability is for some people a big advantage. Are you trying to change that?
No. We have no say over how scheduling works in any particular business in Denver. There is absolutely nothing in the law that says an employee can have a flexible schedule, that only independent contractors can have a flexible schedule. And there are a lot of examples of people who are properly classified as employees who can pick which shifts they work, who can take time off without announcing it. I mean, you especially find this in the staffing industry, where often a client will post a job or a shift or a role, and people can sign up or not at their discretion. The flexibility that people rely upon and enjoy is something that can absolutely exist in an employment relationship.
It's just the wage theft specifically that you're interested in, not some overhaul of this industry. Because it sounds like when you were talking about why you wanted to issue these subpoenas, that you were seeing lots of problems with the labor relations inside these strip clubs. And so this isn't that. This is just about wage theft.
Yeah, that's right. Look, if we wind up finding in any particular investigation that people are misclassified and they should have been paid minimum wage and given paid sick leave and all of the other basic civil rights that workers are entitled to under the law, there's no requirement that all of a sudden those people have to come in at a certain time and wear a certain thing. There's no requirement that any of the practices need to change, other than a business needs to stop committing wage theft.
What's the timeline for this investigation?
It depends. Partly, the timeline in an investigation is always going to depend on how cooperative a business is. If they're going to stonewall us and fight us on every little thing, it's going to take longer.
Are you expecting that?
You know, I think in particular that Westword article was a little surprising to me.
That you were getting this much pushback from the clubs, you mean?
No, that it indicated that they intended to keep fighting these subpoenas even after a hearing officer determined that it wouldn't be an undue burden, that we were entitled to this information, that we had provided adequate guarantees that all confidential information would be protected. And still they indicated to that newspaper, at least, that they were going to keep fighting. I don't know how it's going to turn out, but after reading that, I wouldn't be terribly surprised.
It's just kind of curious to me. You know, I mentioned that we've done some reporting on this industry. I happen to know this company, RCI Holdings. They recently were in another fight with a local municipality over in Central City over whether or not they could open a club in downtown, right on that main street. And this is also like they just got bought by a new operator, and this person is trying to invest a lot in Colorado. And I wonder if you're worried at all about targeting this industry and conveying that, you know, Colorado's not open for business, especially on something that could be interpreted as like a moral crusade.
Oh, it's certainly not a moral crusade, except to the extent that people who work should be paid minimum wage if they're entitled to it. Look, I actually think that I want to reframe what you said a little bit.
Please.
Enforcing wage laws is good for business. And the reason it's good for business is because there are thousands and thousands of employers in Denver who do work hard to follow the law, who do pay minimum wage and provide paid sick leave and give paid rest breaks and do all of the other things that they're required to do. They shouldn't have to compete against an entity that can gain an unfair competitive advantage by violating the law. So when we do enforcement work, we're doing it not only on behalf of the workers who are affected by that particular case, but also all of the high road ethical employers who operate in that industry or in a similar industry, who pay their taxes, who contribute their fair share, who treat their workers with respect, and shouldn't be undercut by illegal practices.
Yeah, because it's unfair to them if their competitors are skirting the law. That's
Absolutely.
Interesting. That's helpful. So just back to the broader issue of wage theft. Like I'm sure there's some people out there listening who are not, who don't work in strip clubs or who maybe don't work in restaurants and are thinking, maybe wage theft is happening to me. Do you have any advice for people who might be worried that they're vulnerable?
Call us. Yes, call us, email us at wagecomplaints@denvergov.org. About 15 of us have access to that email box. We will respond quickly. You can file a complaint on our website. You can email auditor@denvergov.org. We'll also get that. We will answer all of your questions. And by the way, this goes for businesses too. We love it when businesses come to us and they want to be proactive about making sure they're complying with the law.
Does that ever happen?
Yeah. Absolutely.
Really?
Yes.
You've had a business owner come to you and be like, I don't want to be like, am I accidentally stealing people's wages?
In the last 2 weeks, I've had 2 hour-plus long meetings with different business owners who just wanted to make sure that they understood all of their obligations and they weren't going to run afoul. We welcome that. We want that. We regularly collaborate with industry groups to do outreach and education. That's really important. We try to be as proactive as possible to make sure people know both what their rights are under Denver and Colorado law, but also what their obligations are. And look, we've had instances in the past where an employer has come to us and said, I think I made a mistake. I was paying Colorado minimum wage, not Denver minimum wage. Okay, we help them calculate how much they owe. If we need to, we set up a payment plan. And things like penalties are off the table. We want to encourage self-reporting. We want to encourage good behavior.
What about, I'm thinking about, people who are working and just like might not know if they're vulnerable or like might be a little worried there's some gray areas happening. Are there certain situations that you've seen repeated across industries that tend to lead to investigations or rulings from your office?
Independent contractor misclassification is a huge problem. It's a really widespread problem, and candidly, sometimes it can be tough to know if you should be classified as an independent contractor or as an employee, especially because it's something that has become so widespread.
Right. The freelancers, the whole remote work phenomenon post-pandemic, I can totally see how that would happen.
Yeah, absolutely. And again, if people have questions, they can come to us.
So if you're a remote worker and you're working like 35 hours a week for a business, you're saying maybe that you're a person that should be classified as an employee?
Maybe.
Interesting. Yeah. Interesting. Well, I want to know, I want to scoop here. I'd love to break some news, Matthew. Who's next for a subpoena? Can you give me some insider info?
The answer is always going to be, I hope nobody. If we get to the point where we issue a subpoena, it means that our normal process isn't working. So the normal process is we send a letter. We also email it. And employers have about 37 days to get us the information we ask for. If they ask for an extension, we routinely grant those. If we don't get the information, we send a follow-up letter. Only after about 40 days of response time has passed are we going to go ahead and issue a subpoena for things like payroll records. If we issue a subpoena, it means that we're not getting what we need after having asked repeatedly and explained why we need it. So I don't know who's next.
Well, we're going to put a link to that Westword article we were talking about in our show notes so you can read it. And Matthew Fritz Maurer, thank you so much for joining me.
Thanks for caring about wage theft.
That's all for today here on CityCast Denver. If you enjoyed the show, why not take a minute to tell your boss about us? Rate the show wherever you get your podcasts, and subscribe to our morning newsletter and learn more about us at denver.citycast.fm. We'll be back tomorrow morning with more news from around the city. See you then. That's all for today here on City. Ooh, this is old. These credits are old. Old.